There is a garden, there is a city, and there's a kingdom of God. And it is beautiful, and he is bringing it right now into our midst. Good morning, everybody. And welcome to all of you who are joining us over in Life Center and also online. Thanks that you can be a part of our series as we are continuing to move on with our Breaking Bad, Becoming Good. And we are in week number 6. I'm going to tell you about that in just a moment. We planned a few special workshops to go along with the series, and we're doing our final special workshop this evening. It is at 5 o'clock. It is on Mr. Rogers' civility, the kind of lessons we can learn from a truly amazing individual. Even if you didn't sign up, you can show up tonight. Brian Newman told me we're going to be like shooting right out of the gate at 5 o'clock with a pretty significant video clip. So if you're interested in coming, you want to be sure to be there on time, right over there in the Life Center, and look forward to seeing you. So as I mentioned, we are in week number 6. Last week, Pastor Aaron started us off looking at individual character qualities, and we looked at the theme of love. And today we are looking at the word called grit. And the various words, this is the only word that is not actually a biblical word, but there are lots of biblical realities about this particular word. Now, here's what I want to do this morning. I'm going to first set out a couple of very significant scriptures that will frame our entire conversation for the morning. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of role models, and we're going to see how important they are when it comes to this thing called grit. And then we're actually going to say, well, so what is grit, and why does it matter so much? And maybe most important, how do I wind up becoming a more gritful or grittier kind of person that God would want me to have? So here are the scriptures. And the first one is really significant for me, hugely significant. I can't call it a life verse, but I can say this frames everything I think about the Christian life. And Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 says very simply, I am what I am by the grace of God, and his grace to me was not without effect. In other words, this grace of God that has made Paul who he is had a result, it had power, it had a transformative, empowering dynamic in Paul's life, so that now Paul is a different kind of person. He can do different kinds of things because of what grace has done. And so then Paul goes on and says, hey, I worked harder than anybody else, but as I'm doing this really hard work, I understand that it's not just me doing this work, it is the grace of God that is at work in me. Really, really significant passage. It's one of those core passages that we get this wonderful combination of how God's grace empowers you and I for, well, like we talked a few weeks ago, making every effort. And we're going to talk about some of those specific efforts today. All right, the next passage is found in Philippians chapter 3 and chapter 4. And I could give you many verses from Philippians chapter 3, but here's just the part of what Paul is saying. Paul's saying, I'm like forgetting what's behind. It's been good. There's a lot of things I've already done, but you know what? That's the past. And so now I'm straining into the future. There is more of this thing called Christianity that I want to possess. There is more of relationship with God that I want to have. And so then I'm pressing on. It's a very, very energetic word, very, very powerful. Paul has an enormous amount of energy he is exerting as he wants to move into the future that God has for him. But in chapter 4, Paul says, however, you got to know how I can do all this stuff. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. I can do all things through him who gives me strength. Paul just lives in this wonderful intersection of God's grace and power and love and generosity flowing in him that then enables Paul to act and do certain things that are very, very important for Paul and for Paul's ministry. Okay, there's scriptures. We're going to be coming back to those and adding a few more all the way through the message. Let me talk about role models for a little bit and start by telling you a little story about my dad. I was 14 years old when I learned for the first time that my dad was a hero. Now, I learned that my dad was a hero by actually seeing him do something I can only describe as heroic. Many of you know that I grew up, my folks had a cabin on the Susquehanna River. We were midway between Indian Steps Museum and Otter Creek, if you know where that part of the river is. And there was a series of islands that were right out from the shoreline, and they were out 100, 150 yards. And they went if you would head down, you could get out at Indian Steps. If you headed up, you could get out at Otter Creek, out into the main part of the river. So when we wanted to go boating, we would head down or we'd head up. Well, one day we are heading up, and we're going to be going out late afternoon. through the Otter Creek area. And if you are familiar with Otter Creek, you know they've got some pretty amazing rock patterns down there that go right up to the river's edge. And lots of times, kids back then, and especially at our age in that decade, you'd be on the rocks, you'd be sunbathing, you'd be jumping off, you'd be swimming around. And apparently one young man had decided he was going to swim across, and he got himself in trouble, because as we're getting up closer, we're seeing all these people up on the rocks, and they're jumping up and down, and they're waving their hands to get our attention. We were on the boat around, and they're pointing out there in the river. And as we're looking out, there was somebody who was struggling and going under, and it comes back up, he's going under. He was obviously in distress. And so my dad right away begins to get the boat heading over, and then suddenly the kid goes under. My dad says, "Brian, take the wheel." I'm taking the wheel. We slowed the boat down. He says, "Don't move the boat." And he's kicking off his moccasins. He rips off a shirt, and he goes diving into the water, swims out to where the kid had gone down, and then Dad dives underwater. Now there I'm watching. Now first of all, I knew a kid had gone underwater, and now my dad's underwater. The Susquehanna River is not a clear body of water. It's dirty, it's murky, it's muddy, you can't see anything. And I can't see my dad. And my dad is underwater for what seemed to me forever. And finally, when I'm just starting to get to the point of being a little panicky, Dad comes breaking up out of the water, and he's got this kid with him, and Dad gets over to the boat, and we get the kid in the boat, and he's hacking out water, and we take him over to the shoreline, and we get him reunited with his family and friends, and he wound up being okay. And instead of going out to spend the rest of the afternoon skiing, we just kind of went back down home, and what did I just see happen? And Dad didn't even really want to talk about it. That's just the kind of person Dad was. He never really talked very much about himself. It was a couple of years later when we're a little bit of a family get-together, and I'm telling the story from my 14-year-old vantage point. One of his brothers says, "Hey, that's not the first time your dad saved somebody from drowning. He actually saved one of his brothers from drowning one day when they were playing swimming in a Lancaster quarry." And by the way, more of the story, don't go swimming in quarries. But they had gone swimming in quarries, and one of his brothers had just gone down, and he was really down there deep, and he was struggling, and my dad had to dive down and bring him up as well. And role models. Parents are role models for us. They live and they speak and they talk about things in a way that has impact on us. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, when we were earlier in a character series, I sort of threw out a little question on Facebook. I was just asking people, "Hey, what were the good things you learned from Mom and Dad?" And we had 150, maybe quite a few more replies back, and it was very encouraging and warming to read the lessons that our moms and dads had imprinted on us. Now, by the way, I also know that there were some other imprints that were not very good, and at times they weren't very good role models, but there's something very significant about the role model influence that others have in their lives, especially parents. There are role models everywhere, and sometimes we look at those role models and think they are so heroic. I don't know whether to be motivated by them or demotivated because I can't possibly be like them, but I'm regularly looking at Abraham Lincoln, just an amazing individual. Mother Teresa, an amazing individual. The woman in between is Helen Keller, another amazing individual. But do you know they were not born amazing? They were born pretty ordinary people, and they went through this whole series of experiences in life, but in those experiences, they learned to make certain choices, and those choices wound up building something very strong and significant in them. There are very few extraordinary role models that start out extraordinary. That's not how it happens. One of the great privileges of being just one of the pastors, one of the people on staff here, there's lots of us here, is we get to see firsthand the story of so many gritty people. People that God has worked some really significant qualities into their lives. Hey, I want to give a shout out. If you're a public school teacher, you're a gritty person, right? Yeah, shout out. Thank you. It is harder than ever to do it day after day, weeks turning into months and years, and you just keep at it because it's gotten harder and harder, and society is more complex, and families are more broken, and so you have to do so many different roles as a public school teacher, and the only reason you keep on doing it is there's like a gritty factor about your life. Hey, if you're a cancer survivor, you're gritty. You've learned to be gritty. That's the only way you get through all the stuff involved with cancer is you being gritty. And by the way, so have been the family members who love you. And sometimes they've had to be even gritty because they have to deal with a certain kind of pain of watching you and going through what you're doing. They have to be there, and shout out to those family members as well. If you're in recovery, I tell you, everybody who's in recovery knows what it is to be gritty, because every day you've got to make the choice not to partake of that substance abuse that has been ruining your life, and you finally made that decision. You're walking on day after day, weeks and turning into months, and I tell you, that's just pure grit. And so thank you for being that kind of person. And your family members. My word, every recovering substance abuse person, there are family members that they've had to be just as gritty to do that particular journey. The stories are everywhere. Hey, if you're a parent, I know your kids, you've got to be gritty, okay? And by the way, some of the people who are my personal heroes are single parents. Now, all single parents, but in particular, I've known some single moms that what they do as single moms is just simply heroic and staggering and just do it day after day. So shout out to single parents everywhere. And guys, I could go on a lot more. Man, there are so many stories of grit right here in this room. And there's going to be more stories that God is going to be writing the rest of this year. So we are talking about this thing called grit. And as we're doing now each week, we're creating a bit of a word cloud so you can see what it is we mean by this. And you know, there's the positive word, in this case grit, and you'll see a bunch of words around it. We'll unpack a few of those. And then what we're not looking at is the corresponding vice. In this case, there's one of the ancient deadly sins that's called sloth. It's like a complacency, it's a lethargy, it's a laziness, it's a lack of discipline about the good things in life. I mean, those things are like opposite. We're looking at grit today. By the way, on most days we have some blogs that we're posting as well. You can always go to our website and read some of the posts that we're doing. Pastor Aaron had a couple of great ones on love this past week, so you can go and get a few more ideas on grit this week. One day I'm actually going to talk about what sloth is all about and why my word, as you see what it's like, why would I ever want to be in that place? But, you know, grit kind of came into our public awareness, you know, in the last 10, 15 years. There are a couple of very important books. One was the book called Mindset, written by educator Carol Dweck. It's an amazing book. And while she did not use the word grit, she was talking about this mindset of discipline, intentionality, focus, and steadfastness, and all the things that, well, later on, when Angela Duckworth wrote another book a few years later, she used the word grit, and that's become very, very popular in our culture. Both those books are very accessible. We would really encourage you to check those out if you want to go a little deeper in this topic. So what I'm going to wind up doing is I'm going to explain what grit is, and I'm going to tell you why it matters so much, but you're going to get a sense of that as we're going through what it is. And then we're going to ask finally, well, how do you wind up becoming a more gritty kind of person? And what we'll do is we'll use the acronym GRIT to explain what grit is. And if you're okay, I'm going to skip over the G for right now. Most times if you look online, you're going to see like the word guts as the word that they associate with the letter G, but I think there's a much better word we're going to want to associate with G, and I'm going to come to that at the end. So let's move right on to the word called resilience. And that's also become a very, very popular word in our culture. You know, there we got a list of what are some of the things that are associated with resilience. There's like a stamina inside. There's like this like metal. There's this fiber. There's just something inside that you're able to kind of hang in there and keep on hanging in there. When I think about resilience, I see this little thing that I spent a lot of my young years pulling up. That is extraordinarily resilient. They can bust through concrete. They can bust through asphalt. My mom hated dandelions, and this was back in my word. This was so, I don't even know if they had chemicals to kill this stuff. And so instead, she had my brother and me, and so she would give us those little dandelion diggers. You remember those old-fashioned things? You know, they were like a long metal thing with a little fork on the end and a wooden handle, and she'd send us out and say, dig them up by the roots. And after a while, my brother and I would get tired of digging up by the roots. We said, it's just a little bit easier to pick off the flowers and throw them in the bucket, and that's what we did. And about 2 days later, you could see exactly where we dug them up by the roots and where we didn't dig them up by the roots, because all their flowers are back, because they're so darn resilient. But there's something powerful and motivating about a plant that can break through concrete. That's how resilient and powerful it is in its resilience. But maybe one of the most powerful stories of resilience I have ever read about was about the Lost Boys of Sudan. The Lost Boys of Sudan took place a number of decades back, when there had been the Second Sudanese Civil War, north to south, different religious groups going on. And in that particular war, there was a lot of genocide and massacres taking place against the Christians in the south. Large numbers of people were killed. And so what happened is you had all these homeless young people, boys and girls, but in particular, there were like 20,000, they called them the Lost Boys of Sudan. Their homes had been destroyed, their parents had been killed, and they had become orphans, and they had become homeless and rootless, and so they just began walking because they had no place to go. It wasn't safe. And some of them over the next 2 years would walk thousands of miles. I mean, they would just keep on, they just had no place to go. Eventually they heard about refugee camps, and they would try and make their way to the refugee camps, but these were kids 4, 5, and 6 years old, and their older brothers and, you know, 10, 11, and 12 years of age, 20,000 of them. And for the next couple of years, they lived without homes. They faced malnourishment, they faced starvation, disease of every kind, dangers everywhere, dependent upon what charity they could find here and there. They had this post-traumatic stress stuff that was just horrific. And then eventually when they did get their way to, some of them, when they made their way to their refugee camps, so then there they had to go through another whole ordeal of being in refugee camps. And eventually many of them were invited in to come into some of the different countries of the West. And when Becky and I lived up in Syracuse, there were some of the area churches up there that they were actually now the host and sponsor for some of these lost boys of Sudan, and that's when I became familiar with their story. I'm just thinking, this is a story of amazing resilience. I cannot even imagine what it's like to be a 4 or 5 or 6-year-old or 10, 11, 12, and 2 years of walking and just walking. And I mean, it's resilience that is unimaginable. Well, the Apostle Paul talks about the things that happen to you and I in life. And he talks about his experiences quite a bit in 2 Corinthians. The whole letter is a letter of resilience. But in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 7 through 11, Paul says these words: we have this treasure in jars of clay. That is, we have this life of God, this new life, this vitality in these human bodies, so that we can show all the surpassing power of everything that's taking place. It's from God. It's not from us. We didn't materialize it. It's from God. But look at what this surpassing power of God is now making possible. We are hard pressed on every side. There are really hard things, but we're not crushed. We're perplexed, but we're not in despair. We've been persecuted, but we've not been abandoned. We are struck down, but we are not destroyed. So therefore, we are living with this resilience and faith and trust and experience of God with us, even though things are so very, very hard around us. You know, a couple of the recent studies I've been reading on resilience, the authors wind up saying that on their vote, the number one most important character quality is what Pastor Aaron talked about last week, and that is love. Nothing more important than love, but several of the authors say they think what really deserves careful consideration for the second most important character virtue is that of resilience. And in fact, these authors go on and say, you know, even love is not going to last without resilience. We all know that love fades, love falters, love can fall away, love can become shaky, and so even resilience is needed for the love that we have for the people we need to love, and sometimes they're hard to love. We need resilience, so we kind of hang in there with this thing called love. Resilience makes love last. So there's something really significant to this thing called resilience as a part of grit. The letter I. I stands for, well, I had actually a little bit of a dilemma here. I was really torn, and so I listed a whole bunch of words there. But intentionality is the one that I decided to choose. But right underneath that, I listed inspiration, because there's something really significant going on here. We need inspiration. We need motivation. We need a vision. We need some captivating meaning and purpose. And then when we get that inspiring thing, whatever it is, it winds up leading into intentionality. It leads to determination. It leads to dedication. It leads to devotion to that thing that has now inspired us. And then we wind up making these daily choices to be disciplined and responsible about what we're determined to get. So that's what I mean. There's a lot of different words there in this thing, in this little letter I: intentionality, inspiration. Abraham Lincoln wound up saying, here's a definition of discipline. Discipline is when you have to choose between what matters now and what matters most. So there's always things that, hey, this matters right now, go for it. But there's other things that matter the most. And when we have something that's inspiring and motivating, a vision of what's better, and we have the determination, then discipline helps us choose not what we would like to have now, but what we would like to have later. And we continue to go for it day after day. My dad, let me come back to my dad, tell another little story about him. So we were down on another river story. You remember Hurricane Agnes in 1972? I know a bunch of you weren't even born then. Oh, that's terrible. 1972 Hurricane Agnes was the most devastating hurricane that ever came through this area, and what it did was just amazing. I mean, the power of water. There's 3 different dams on the Susquehanna River. There's the Safe Harbor Dam, which is up closer to Harrisburg. There is the Holtwood Dam, which is a little bit south of us. And then you go much further south, and you have the Conowingo Dam. Well, our place was between the Holtwood Dam and the Safe Harbor Dam and made what was called Lake Aldred. During Hurricane Agnes, we knew it was really bad, and they're saying the river's flooding like it's never flooded before. And eventually, when it had stopped raining, we said, hey, let's get down and see if there was any damage done. And as we're trying to get down to the river, we couldn't even get down to where our cabin was because the Susquehanna had so massively overflowed its banks. We then wound up driving down to where Holtwood Dam was, and there's a little place there where, like an observatory, you could look. And we're looking out at the dam, and there's this wall of water 10, 15, 20 foot high, and it just poured over that dam hour after hour after hour, day after day. That's how much water had flowed into the Susquehanna Basin. And as we're watching the water flow over the dam, we're seeing boat after boat after boat go right over the dam. Well, eventually when the waters went down and we were able to get closer to our place, we realized that some of those boats were our boats. And in particular, our ski boat, because one of the things we did the most, and our just family kind of hovered around that, was we just loved skiing. And so here we had a cabin and no boat to ski with, and Dad knew how important these particular experiences were for all of us, how much we enjoyed that. That was a central part of our time. And so Dad made the decision he was going to buy another boat, but Dad was not a guy to go into debt for things. Dad was very responsible with his money, and he was actually going to get a better boat than what we had, which, if you don't know anything about the world of boats, are a little expensive. And so what Dad made the decision was he was going to get a second job to pay for the boat. And when he realized what was going to be involved with this, Dad realized he was going to get a second full-time job to work that for a while to pay for the boat. So my dad worked second shift as the second shift supervisor for the plant, and he had been invited by York Votech, just ironically a little bit earlier, if he would come and be their teacher in his particular field, especially for the coming calendar year, because they had lost their teacher. And Dad had originally said no. He called him back up and said he'll take the job. So what my dad did is he went out and bought the boat because he knew he was going to have 2 full-time jobs. We enjoyed the boat for many, many years. But then here's what I saw. Dad, when we got up to go to school, Dad got up to go to teach at Votech. When we got home from school, Dad got home from Votech. Dad had a little bit of time to rest and have supper, and then Dad went to work his second full-time job. And then Dad came home and Dad slept. And he did that for more than 8 months. Now, Dad was around on the weekends, and we had good times and stuff, but there was one time I was just saying, Dad, how can you keep on doing this? And here's one of those things where this is not exactly his words, but this is my memory as it's been slowly filtered and understood. He said, Brian, you can do anything for a while if what you're doing matters to you and when you see that there's some light at the end of the tunnel. I can do this for a school year. I can do this for a school year because it matters that our family has these kinds of experiences, and I don't want to go into debt. And man, I tell you what, I just saw there was something about my dad's intentionality. There was a vision he had of things. It wasn't the boat. That's not the boat was just a means to these experiences that he wanted us to have as a family that were so important for us. By the way, any high-performing athlete, any athlete who's hitting peak performance, they know exactly what we're talking about. They need to have a vision that inspires them, that then creates this determination that results in daily discipline and choices. The same for musicians, really the same for any area of life where we wind up wanting to move into peak performance. I mean, you need an inspiration and intentionality, then the daily discipline to move toward that. By the way, if you want to get one of the best stories I have seen in recent years of an amazing woman with an even more amazing vision, watch the movie Harriet. It's available on probably pay for demand and whatnot. It's about Harriet Tubman, who wound up becoming a slave who escaped from slavery. She made her way up to Baltimore, and then she was not content with the fact that she had escaped and she had family and friends down there, and so she was determined to go back because here was the vision. I'll either be free or I'll die. I don't want to live as a slave. Death or freedom were her options, not only for herself, but for the other people that she cared about. And she cared about them so deeply that she became known as the Moses of her people. She led so many people that were slaves into freedom. It is an amazing story of an inspiration and vision that she saw that created this determination and dedication to one of the hardest of tasks, and she just made this daily disciplined choices to do what needed to be done. It is an amazing story, and I tell you, the movie is so historically accurate. It is so historically accurate. And as it portrays this powerful faith that God is giving her and the work of God in her, you're going to see once again, by the grace of God, she became the woman that she was. But all of these things pale into into almost like insignificance when we think about Jesus Christ. We read about Jesus in Hebrews chapter 12, where fix your eyes upon Jesus, this author and perfecter of our faith. Fix your eyes on Jesus, who for the joy set before him Right? Jesus saw something out there that was very joyful, and what he saw was so joyful that he was willing to endure the cross and despise and the shame and the pain and the torture and the torment. He was willing to do all that because he saw something that was joyful for him. What was the joy that Jesus saw? He saw you and I. He saw us here. He saw us free. He saw us forgiven. He saw us flourishing. He saw us with the life of his Father being poured into us. He saw us going from immaturity to maturity and on to fullness. I mean, that's what Jesus saw. That's what he saw, and he knew the cross was the only way to get there, to that joy. And so that vision, that inspiring vision of a free, forgiven people gave Jesus the determination and the discipline to day after day do what he needed to do to get that particular end result. That's intentionality. And do we need this kind of intentionality? Okay, that leads me to the final letter, and that is T. And let me use the word tenacity to describe this particular component of grit. And once again, there's a number of different things here, and I could have organized them a little bit better, but let me say there's two parts to tenacity. Number one is that there is a courage and there is a fortitude that we have, and then that courage and fortitude winds up producing endurance and perseverance. So we keep on keeping on. We don't stop, but keep on keeping on. You see how resilience, intentionality, and tenacity, they all begin to hang together. Helen Keller was one of those people that she understood tenacity, and she was tenacious about overcoming the immense things she had. And so Helen Keller has this beautiful saying, as she's observed her own life and the life of others. She said, the world is filled with suffering, but the world is also filled of the overcoming of suffering. Isn't that beautiful? Oh, suffering is everywhere, even here at Living Word. But the overcoming of suffering is everywhere. If only we will hang in there with the tenacity we need until it's overcome. Winston Churchill, when World War II was growing, and it was now obvious that the Nazis were going to wind up invading England, and they were not prepared. He had to mobilize a nation that was already feeling defeated, tired, discouraged, fearful. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat, as he's speaking to the British government. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months that will turn out to be years of struggle and of suffering. You ask, what is our policy? I say it is to wage war by sea, land, and air with all of our might and with all of the strength that God can give to us. Our policy is to wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalog of human crime. That's our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be, for without victory there is no survival. My word, with those words of tenacity to the British people, who were, again, not at a place of tenacity. They were at a place of defeat and wanting to give up. He had to mobilize the spirit of tenacity in the nation of the people to stand against the most monstrous tyranny of evil that there was, until other nations like ours could be mobilized to come to their aid. The old mystic poet, Khalil Gibran, he says, out of sufferings have emerged the strongest of souls. Out of sufferings have emerged the most massive characters, but they are seared with scars. Look, this is some of the deep mystery of suffering. It is out of suffering that the most massive of souls, the strongest of souls, are formed. But we are formed and we are seared with the scars of our suffering, but we are not undone by those scars. So that leads me to now, why does it matter? Why does grit matter? Why does resiliency matter? Why does an inspired intentionality matter? Why does tenacity matter? Well, haven't we been already answering the question? It matters because none of the alternatives are worth living. None of the alternatives are worth living. Life happens, and sometimes life happens really, really hard. Do you ever feel like some things are just kind of, the dominoes are collapsing and you're trying to hold this one up? You ever feel like that? And you know that if you don't hold it up, it's just going to have a chain reaction and it's going to be a whole lot worse. So somebody's got to hold it up. Somebody's got to stand in the gap and hold it up. Do you ever feel like the lighthouse that is, the storms, the waves are pounding, but they're pounding and you just got to stand there. I mean, you need to stand there for the sake of others. Life happens. Sometimes life happens really hard. Psalm 23, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And we'll go on, I will fear no evil, and there's a reason why. But there are valleys of shadows of death that we wind up going through because sometimes life happens really, really hard for us. So when those things happen, what are you going to do? Well, number one, you could give up. But I tell you what, if you give up, then nothing good is going to come from you giving up. Nothing good comes when you give up. But some people give up, and they diminish. Some people wind up kind of like regressing, and they get down to this like sort of lower level of living, and they just kind of stay there. Sometimes people kind of wind up going backwards, but eventually they bounce back a little bit, and they wind up getting by. But those are not good options. None of those are good options. We wind up always settling for life at a much lower level. And so really the only option that is worth living is for when you and I, when we find the hardships of life, we choose to get going, we choose to get growing. And I just use the phrase, we grit up. We grit up. We don't give up, we grit up. And that's exactly why we need to grit up, because all the other options, look at them. None of them are worth living for. None of those other options will make life worth living. The only option that makes life worth living is when you go, grow, and grit up. Chuck Swindoll was one of my favorite old preachers. I think he might be still preaching. It's amazing. He said long ago, decades ago, life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you respond. 10% what happens to you, no matter how hard it is, even traumatic, no matter how hard it is, life is only 10% what happens. 90% of life is what you do about what happens to you. You can't control what happens to you, but I tell you sure can control what you wind up doing with what happens to you. And that is what makes all the difference. Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust concentration camp survivor, of all people, who was most qualified because he saw people who gave up. And we would certainly not blame anyone for giving up. But he wound up saying, but it is so intriguing, so something that the very same forces of life that threaten to overwhelm us and destroy us are the exact same things that wind up somehow making us fully human, fully alive. And he said, for those who did not give up, but they gritted up, God just did some amazing things in their lives. That's why it matters. And so therefore, here's my final question. How do you get it? And now we need to go to the G word. You know what it is, don't you? It's God, it's grace, and it's His goodness. That's how you get it. By the way, that's what all the secular stuff is missing. For the G word, they'll have down guts, and we can put that in. But, the part that's missing is God and grace and His goodness. Angela Duckworth, the title of her book, Grit, the power of passion and perseverance. We say, yes, absolutely, the power of passion and perseverance matters. But we're going to say there are other things that matter even more. What matters even more is the power of God's promises and the power of God's provision for us and the presence of God with us. That matters even more. Yes, life is going to be hard. Yes, there are going to be troubles. Yes, there'll be challenges. But God is greater. Our God is greater. And He is at work in our lives in those times. And so Jesus says, my Father is always at work right now to this very day. Oh, and by the way, I'm working too in those hard times. Romans chapter 8, verses 28 to 29. Here's how our God is at work. He's at work taking all these things, and somehow in the way that only He can do, He is bringing good, He is bringing beauty, He is bringing grit, resilience, intentionality, tenacity out of all of those things. They were meant to undo you, but God is using them to make you who you are meant to be. In Philippians chapter 1, verse 6, and he says, I promise you this, He will complete the good work He started. At age 66, my really gritty dad, full of resilience, intentionality, inspiration, tenacity. He was diagnosed with cancer of the esophagus, of the liver, and of the pancreas. That was more than 20 years ago. Those are pretty tough cancers today. Back then, they were more than deadly. He made it about 7 months. A guy who had never been sick a day in his life, he made it about 7 months. He wasn't gritty enough. Along the way, he discovered he needed more than resilience, intentionality, and tenacity. And along the way, for the first time in his life, he discovered Christ. He discovered the grace of God and the goodness of God, that yes, though my dad was walking through the final valley of the shadow of death, he did not have to fear evil because God was with him and God's power was greater. My dad gave his life to Christ. I wish he would have done it when he was 40, but I'm glad he did it at 66. God's grace is greater. Look at all those words, all those words. That's what we've been talking about, all those words. That's the package. And now let me finish with what I started with. We are who we are by the beautiful grace of God, and his grace is not without effect. It is so powerful. And God winds up saying to Paul, and I want you to hear him saying this to all of us right now. In 2 Corinthians, God says to Paul, Paul, my grace is sufficient. Oh, Paul, you're going through some really hard times. My grace is sufficient. Paul, you got more troubles coming your way. My grace is sufficient. Paul, by the time I'm done with you, you're going to be amazing. Let's pray. God, I know right now, there's a lot of us that we're living in places, man, it's good, and we're praising you, and we're rejoicing. I know there's some other folks that we're living in some pretty tough places, and life is happening pretty hard for some of us. But thank you, Lord, that your grace is sufficient, more than sufficient. And so for each person here, no matter where they are in their journey with you, I'm just going to pray that your grace will be sufficient. For some of them, it might be for the very first time when they just open themselves up to your grace. For others of us, we just need another dose of your grace to come in and start to create that stuff that needs to be created in our lives. But Lord, do that. Begin to write some more beautiful stories of the grittiness that is produced by the goodness of your grace. Amen.